And thank you folks for coming out this evening to celebrate the life and music of Charles Ives. Ives is sometimes described in the history books as the father of American concert music, in the same way that, for example, Franz Joseph Haydn is sometimes discussed as the father of the symphony, or the father of classical music, big C classical, the music of the classical style. So too, Ives is considered a patriarchal figure when it comes to the American concert hall. Now, the irony here is multi-layered. Let's start with the most emphatic ironic element here, which is that Ives didn't live to see any of his music performed in a concert hall. That would come posthumously. In fact, his popularity as a composer, in fact, one might even say his presence on the proverbial radar of other composers didn't really happen until he was in his 50s or even his 60s. So, even though he has this very lofty title, the father of American concert music, or sometimes the father of American classical music, it's worth beginning by pointing out that this was something that came much later in Ives' life. That is to say, the recognition of his achievements and of his contributions to the literature when it came to American compositions of the concert hall, and of the idioms that we associate with the concert hall. Idioms, for example, like the symphony. The symphony had been a towering flagship genre since the 1750s and 60s, with lesser-known composers like Christoph Wagenseil, Sammartini, Stamitz. I mean, these were the guys who were pioneering the symphony in the 1750s and 60s. Along came Haydn, and then the symphony transforms in the hands of Beethoven and later composers, including Schumann and Mendelssohn, and of course Brahms. And then we get to the end of the 19th century with Bruckner and Mahler. And some people think that maybe that's the end of the symphony, right? Even inveterate concertgoers may think of the symphony as having an arc that starts with Haydn and ends, say, with Mahler. But it's not true, because there's Charles Ives, other composers as well, but as far as composers who were writing in a distinctly American, idiosyncratic style, we have to include Charles Ives in that conversation. And the Ives symphonies, while they are very difficult to perform, especially the Fourth Symphony, for reasons we'll get into tonight, they're a significant contribution to the repertoire that cannot be gainsaid or discounted. In other genres, for example, the piano sonata, how many of us took piano lessons at some point in our lives, or watched our kids or grandkids take piano lessons? Right, the sonata is another flagship genre of Western art music. Think about those 19 Mozart sonatas or the 32 Beethoven sonatas. Some of you may have played the little sonatinas by Clementi and other composers. Well, we have to consider Ives part of that conversation too, because he wrote towering sonatas, not many, but it's the second one which is by far the most famous, the most celebrated. It's a work we're not going to get to tonight because it is just too vast in scope to shoehorn into a larger program on Ives. But you should all have this work on your map, and that work is the Concord Sonata. The Concord Sonata, named after Concord, Massachusetts. Think of Walton Pond, for example. Ives was tremendously inspired by New England and its landscapes and monuments and famous places. And we'll talk a little bit about that tonight, but we won't get to the Concord Sonata, but it should be on your map. Why? Because once again, it establishes this continuum from the great composers of the classical world, going back to the mid-18th century, all the way into the mid-20th century with Charles Ives. So when we talk about his contributions, yes, he was avant-garde in some ways. Yes, the music is dissonant and sometimes chaotic, sometimes described as tumultuous. Sometimes his musical style is completely atonal. We'll talk about that tonight as well. Don't run away yet. But my goal, I suppose, that what I'm trying to articulate here is that Ives exists on a continuum of composers. That his music, even though he didn't live to see it come into the concert hall, by and large, his music exists on this line that extends from the great composers of yesteryear all the way into the 20th century. And it tells us a few things. Number one, that these genres that we sometimes suppose or surmise kind of vanished after the 19th century ended, they continue to thrive in the 20th century, but with new musical idiomatic languages that alienated audiences. We'll talk about why that is in tonight's program. Ives is a big part of that when it comes to the American concert scene, the American art music scene. And you could make the argument that Ives, in some way, paves a road for composers like Leonard Bernstein and of course Aaron Copland, who was born just about a quarter century after Ives, and other composers who came later, including, for example, someone we're going to talk about later in this series, born in 1930, the great Stephen Joshua Sondheim. So Ives really is deserving of this moniker, the father of American concert music, the father of American classical music. But it raises another question. If Ives was born in 1874, and America was founded about a century before that, why did it take a century for a patriarchal figure to come in and, as I suggested earlier, pave the road for an authentic, unique American musical style? That's a very good question, isn't it? In other words, we've mentioned a few other composers, so let's mention them again. Beethoven died in 1827. Brahms was born in 1833. Chopin died in 1849. Liszt lived into the 1880s, so did Wagner. So we may ask the following question. Who are the great American composers who are, say, contemporaneous with Brahms, or Mendelssohn, or Chopin, or Wagner? And many of us will scratch our heads and rub our chins, rather like Rodin's thinker, and say, Who comes to mind? Perhaps the most famous name, the most salient name in the canon of American popular music is probably Stephen Foster, right? Who wrote what are sometimes broadly referred to as parlor songs. Parlor songs should not be confused with the great art songs of 19th century Europe. Schubert's songs, for example, the Lieder, L-I-E-D-E-R, German for songs. Die schöne Müllerin, the beautiful miller's maid. Winterreise, the winter's journey. Or Robert Schumann's songs, like Dichterliebe, the poet's love. These are songs that are celebrated today and studied in music theory classrooms and in vocal lessons and studios and prepared for recitals, I would suggest, all over the globe. We don't really have a lot of people preparing recitals of Stephen Foster songs unless it would be for a distinct celebration of 19th century American popular music. The reason is, with all due deference to Mr. Foster, that Stephen Foster's songs lack what we might call the harmonic intricacy, the melodic sophistication of the music that I alluded to earlier by Schubert and Schumann and Brahms and those other great composers of Lieder, L-I-E-D-R. And so the music of Stephen Foster is important in some way, but it's a footnote. Does that make sense? If you were to open a music history textbook, go to any college classroom, and it doesn't matter if it's Norton or McGraw-Hill or Cengage or whoever it is, Stephen Foster is probably going to be a footnote in the textbook. Whereas Schubert and Schumann and the other great songwriters of the same period will get pages of musicological ink devoted to discussing their feats and their works. So Foster's music is important, it's interesting in a way, but it isn't considered by professional musicians to be in the same league. Does that make sense? And this is why, for example, nobody talks about Stephen Foster as the father of American classical music. Because what he was writing wasn't really classical music. He wasn't writing symphonies and concerti and operas and works that we associate with high art. Does that make sense? We can, by the way, you can criticize it if you like. You can say that's snobbish and that's very supercilious. That's a kind of arrogant way of looking at things. And of course, we're talking about academics here, folks. So, I mean, you know, if you want to accuse academicians of being snobbish, go right ahead. I work with a lot of these people. I've met a lot of them in my studies at symposia and colloquia, and I can tell you firsthand, if you think these people are snobbish, they're probably orders of magnitude more snobbish than you think. But the attitude is that Stephen Foster and music of that sort is just not sophisticated enough. There were other composers who did what any American composer, if you were an aspiring composer of, say, the 1830s or 40s, and you were born into a family that had means, and perhaps there was that beautiful thunderstorm of not only nature but also nurture, and you were very precocious, here's what your parents might do. Put you on a steamship and send you to Europe. If you want to be a great musician, let's put you on a boat. You're going to go to Paris. You'll go to Rome. You'll go to Berlin. You'll go to London. Why? Well, think about it. In the inchoate days of America's, say, first 5 decades, where would the musical infrastructure be for a thriving career in music? Which conservatory are you going to study at in the 1830s? Which concert hall are you going to have your music performed at? Even the most iconic concert halls, the ones that we think of as existing since time immemorial, really don't come around to the late 19th century. Metropolitan Opera, 1880s. Symphony Hall, about a decade before that. And so, if you were an aspiring composer in the days of when Brahms was, for example, growing up, he went to Europe. Does that make sense? There's a great example of this, a composer by the name of Louis Moreau Gottschalk. A footnote in music history, but again, if you study American music of the 19th century, Gottschalk's going to come up. Most of us would say, who the heck is Gottschalk? Well, he had an interesting background. He was from New Orleans, and he was very precocious. What we would probably today call a child prodigy, a wunderkind. And he was so precocious that his parents did exactly what we just discussed. They put him on a steamship and they sent him to Paris. And in the 1830s, whose music was all the rage in Paris? Chopin. I mean, the Chopin was Polish, but he moved to Paris right around 1830. And so Gottschalk wound up writing pretty good music, but you know what it sounds like? Like a knockoff version of Chopin, which is still pretty good, by the way. Better than most people could do. But if you had the choice 200 years later, and the canon is very crowded, that is to say, the Hall of Fame of musical composers is very crowded, and you can either listen to Chopin or Gottschalk. Who are you going to listen to? You could either listen to Chopin's nocturnes, or you could listen to the guy who more or less invented that genre, an Irishman by the name of John Field. Who are you going to listen to? Chopin or John Field? So John Field becomes a footnote in history. Does that make sense? And we return to Ives. Ives' music is known, I would say perhaps more than for anything else, for its novelty, originality, and authenticity. He was a man who was very firm in his convictions about what his music would sound like, and because of his tremendous success in his real job, that is to say his vocational success as a pioneer of what you might call proto-actuarial science and estate planning and insurance sales, life insurance specifically, Ives did very well. So he could write music and he didn't really have to worry about who was going to buy his manuscripts and which publisher was going to take them on and who was going to buy tickets to go see his music. He didn't have to worry about that. And so he retreated to the quiet sanctuary of his piano room in his home, where after returning from the city, he'd leave at 5 p.m., and he'd get home around 7, and he'd have dinner. His wife Harmony ran the house and made sure that things were moving along smoothly, and that when Charlie came home, there was dinner so that Charlie could eat, and then piano. He would sit there till 11 or 12 p.m., 12 a.m. that is. And then he would go to sleep, and he'd wake up at 5 a.m., get on a train at 7, rinse and repeat. And he wrote a huge corpus of music, without ever really thinking much about whether it would or wouldn't be performed. We're going to start with an early piece, what falls under the umbrella of what musicians call juvenilia, which is exactly what it sounds. Juvenilia is music written before the time when most scholars and historians and biographers would agree on when the composer achieves a mature style. So for example, if you listen to Mozart, Mozart's juvenilia would include the very early symphonies, early operas like Lucia Silla, and then by the time Mozart's like 15, he's considered a mature composer. For most composers, it comes later. The first work we're going to listen to was written when Ives was about 20. He was in his Yale days, where he made C's in his music classes. Not because he didn't get it. Obviously, he was, trust me, I've seen what it looks like when a student doesn't get it. Ives got it, but he had his own ideas about what the music should sound like, and that was why he got C's, which Ives wore as a badge of honor. He called it a gentleman's grade. All right, let me talk about some of the salient elements that make Ives Ives. Number one, quotation. One of the things that makes Ives' music so deliciously American and so authentically American sounding is his frequent quotation of American popular tunes. These would include a lot of melodies that most of us here would not recognize. They would be melodies, for example, associated with church services where he played, or with the military bands of the 1860s, which his father was directing. His father was I think a captain, or maybe even a higher end, maybe a major in the Northern Army during the Civil War. He was a band leader. That was George Ives' primary vocation in the Army, was as a band leader. And he taught Charles Ives, in an unconventional fashion. He would have him perform exercises like this. Here's a C major scale. And he would say to Charles, Charles, you're going to sing a D major scale while I play that. And Charles would have to sing. If you can't already tell, that's extraordinarily difficult to do. To hear C major and to sing a totally different key, whether it's at the second, at the tritone, at the perfect fifth, whatever it is, Charles Ives learned to do it all. He learned to understand how to hear tones that were dissonant against the tones he was hearing, or how to hear music that was in two keys at once. How can you have music that's in two keys at once? What would that sound like? Some people who have a little bit of musical background might think it sounds chaotic, and maybe just incoherent in a way. For example, if we take a popular Mozart sonata, what happens if I take the right hand and I play that in C major where it's written, but instead of playing the left hand in C major to match it, what if I play the left hand in, say, C sharp major? Then I might get something like this. Or if I reverse it, now I'll play the right hand in C sharp and the left hand in C. What do you think? I don't know, a wild idea, right? Now, it's fair to point out that this was a very novel idea in Ives' day. Not a lot of people were doing things like this. And it goes well beyond this. We have the quotations of march music, church hymns, and again, a lot of it might be lost on us today because we don't necessarily, if I said to you, hey, quick, hum the first few bars of From Greenland's Icy Mountains. Most people today can't do that. If I said, hey, sing the first few lines of Hail Columbia, most people probably would struggle with that. But you will nonetheless recognize tunes. He will quote, for example, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, or Yankee Doodle. So these are some tunes that we would broadly consider them part of the American vernacular. These are sounds that are associated with American, either folk tunes or hymns of some sort, but melodies that speak very directly to the American sonic experience. Something that you would learn, for example, as a child, that you might grow up singing at assembly in grade school, in primary school. Does that make sense? So you'd hear it. It wouldn't be something you'd be taught necessarily, but you would absorb it in the way that people absorb church hymns, or that people absorb folk melodies. And he quotes them all the time in his music, sometimes in polytonal fashion, as I played earlier. Sometimes what he'll do is he'll change the key of the piece as he's playing it. So Yankee Doodle might sound like this. And then he'll just change the key. Do you see that? Sometimes he'll do it at the same time. And so you get it in A major and C major at the same time. Sometimes he'll overlap it so that while one voice in the orchestra is playing the first few bars of Yankee Doodle, another voice in the orchestra is playing a totally different part. And he would bring in these melodies. They could be a fife melody, something that would have been played on the battlefield in the Civil War. Fife plays in a register that's higher than the flute but slightly lower than the piccolo, but that extreme high-pitched sound that would cut through the battlefield, the din of the drums and whatever else. And he'll write melodies that would be at home on a fife. We'll listen to one today. So we're going to start with a tune that was written during Ives' college days. So again, we would consider this under the umbrella of juvenilia. He hasn't really reached his mature powers as a composer of orchestral music at this point. Most college students are not well versed in writing orchestral music. But he was a very fine organist. Again, he grew up in an extremely musical home. By the way, that's not enough. just to be descended from musicians or to grow up in a musical home. There's a genetic component too, just like there is in athletics, right? If you want to be a great bodybuilder, well, you have to have a certain frame, certain fast twitch muscle fibers, and that's your hard wiring. Ives was an exceptional organist. We know this because he started filling in and playing church services as a teenager. Let me just suggest that the organ is not an instrument for the faint of heart. I sometimes joke that most people will never meet an organist, and if you do, you will never meet an amateur organist or a casual organist. What would that mean to be a casual organist? Oh yeah, well, you know, I played softball on Sunday, and on my way home I stopped by the church and played the organ for a few hours. You see, it's an incredibly demanding instrument. It requires facility and independence not only in the hands across various manuals, but also you have to be able to play with your feet. Not just simple rudimentary bass lines, but if you look at a Bach fugue, whatever you play in one hand, you'll have to play in the other hand, and eventually you'll have to play on the pedal board with your feet. Here's a setting of, what else? What would we start our series with, Elaine, but variations on America, or My Country 'Tis of Thee. We all know this melody. It's a very simple melody. Ives sets it here mostly in F major, but not exclusively, as we'll see. At one point, one hand is in F major, and the other hand's in the lovely key of D flat major. Why not? Again, that's that polytonality we discussed. But Ives does amazing things with this. He sets it rather simply at first, and then as it goes on, it becomes more complex, more dissonant, more chaotic. Some of them have totally different, I guess what you'd call grooves, the feel of the beat and where it flows. One of them has a dance feeling to it, and it's transposed to F minor. All of these are difficult to play, but it's the finale, which it sounds like you're at a carnival. I've loved that sound, the chaotic sound of a carnival or a fair. He conjures this in a great many pieces, and you'll see it in one of the variations we're going to listen to of My Country 'Tis of Thee. Some of you may note the irony here that the first piece we're starting with is My Country 'Tis of Thee, which you may also know for the incipit lyrics, God save our queen or king, depending on who's the reigning monarch. The truth is that the melody itself has rather murky, rather nebulous origins. I'll play the tune so you all know what I'm talking about. I think most of us know it, but it's this one. And the tune's origins, we think, probably go back as early as the Renaissance. The earliest documented encounter with this piece in writing comes from a collection of English songs from the 1740s, the Harmonica Angelica, something like that. It's like a Latin name. And it was a tune that really gained traction during the reign of George II in the 1740s. During the Jacobite Rebellion. So the tune is British in its origin, but you know, if it's a good tune, you'll take it, right? Think about it this way. After Vatican II, the Catholic Church approved certain Bach hymns for use in Catholic services. And if they're using Lutheran hymns in the Catholic Church, you know they're good tunes. And I guess Ives' attitude here with My Country 'Tis of Thee was that it may have had origins as a British tune, but it became de facto an American tune. So let's listen to a little bit of his setting of My Country 'Tis of Thee as a set of theme and variations. Theme and variations is a very rich genre. Again, Ives is not inventing new genres necessarily. That's kind of the point. The point is that he exists on this continuum, as we spoke about, with symphonies and sonatas. And here with the theme and variations, which, think of all the great composers who wrote theme and variations. Mozart and his variations on what we would call Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. It's actually based on a French lullaby. Or Beethoven and his Diabelli variations, Bach and the Goldberg variations. So this is a very rich genre that had existed for hundreds of years before Ives. Here's his contribution to the theme and variation genre of an organ work based on My Country 'Tis of Thee. chord. Can you imagine operating all of this machinery? So a very simple, straightforward setting here, right? No frills on this variation. Notice how dissonant this one is. Can you hear how crunchy that is? This is a polytonal one I was referring to earlier. The hands are in different keys. Carnival music, right? All you need is a cotton candy. Notice the rhythmic hiccups. Tango in a minor key. And this leads into the finale. Not bad for a college kid, right? Well, again, that was written by Ives when he was in his years at Yale, where he studied with a guy named Horatio Parker, who was a very prominent composer in the late 19th century. And Parker later reflected on the fact that he had given Ives these less than wonderful grades. And Ives had become, much later on, this sensation. And Parker basically acknowledged that while Ives had a ton of potential, he didn't want to follow any rules. Whatever the assignment was, he didn't want to do whatever the assignment was. He had his own ideas about how the music should sound. So we see it there. This is a great example. Imagine a college student. The rebelliousness is kind of teeming there. It is percolating to the surface, especially in some of those movements where the dissonance is dialed up to 11. We have to remember that Ives was a product of having been born in 1874, he was growing up in a period where music was changing. And the big change here was the atonal revolution of the late 19th and early 20th. It starts with Wagner, maybe. You could make the case that in 1865, Wagner premiered an opera, Tristan und Isolde. And that opening chord, the Tristan chord, was so harmonically nebulous, people didn't know what to make of it. And then you get to the end of the century and you've got composers like Strauss and Debussy. And then in the early 20th, you've got Stravinsky and Schoenberg. And Ives was there to witness it all. He knew about those composers and he knew about the direction of music. And one might say that he probably felt a sense of liberation there, not having to cleave to traditional tonal forms and traditional architecture. He could kind of do whatever he wanted. And we see that in the variations on My Country 'Tis of Thee. Again, a melody that goes back in print to the 1740s, to the Jacobite period, and probably goes back well before that as some kind of a folk tune or some tune passed on by oral tradition. In college and beyond, Ives became very interested in transcendentalist philosophy. He was a great fan of Thoreau, for example. He read Walden cover to cover more than once. Despite the fact that he was one might say a pacifist, I think it's fair. Ives himself described himself as a pacifist. He did not believe in war. He wasn't a warmonger. He didn't believe in it. And we can imagine that his father must have told him, or at least carried the trauma of having witnessed whatever he witnessed in the Civil War. Ives was very circumspect about American involvement in war. And yet when America joined World War I on the side of the Allies in 1917, he was very resolved that this was the correct thing to do. And he wrote songs to commemorate what was happening. He wrote a song about Flanders Field. And this next song we're going to listen to is part of a collection of songs written during the World War I period. This one dates from 1917-18. It's called He Is There. And it tells a story, a very coherent story in strophic form. Strophic means there's various verses with the same music. And the story tells, or that he tells, is about a kind of a quintessential American boy. Not anyone in particular, it's a sort of everyman. And the American boy grows up watching his grandfather attend the Decoration Day Parade. That is to say, his grandfather is implied to be a Civil War veteran. And the boy grows up ostensibly in the early 20th century, And all of a sudden, America is pulled into a war, what was not called World War I back then, but simply called the Great War, capital G, capital W. And Ives tells the story here, he wrote the poetry as well, about this boy who grows up at 15 years after he went and accompanied his granddaddy in the Decoration Day parade. Now he sailed over the ocean to beat up all the warlords, as they're called. That would be the Kaiser and the German powers on the other side who were fighting on the other side of the trenches. The song that starts, it has a tonal quality to it. It really is in B flat. Those of you who have a bit of music will see it has a key signature. But it starts on a diminished chord, and it's typical Ives in some ways, but it is very tonal. However, you will notice that it gets more and more chaotic as the piece goes on. And the big climax is on the word shout, where the baritone goes up on the word shout. And what is the boy shouting? The battle cry of freedom. So again, think this is connecting Ives from his father's day, his father having been a Civil War ranking member of the Union Army. I think he was a colonel or a captain or something like that, at least a captain. And now he's connecting it to the reality he was living through in 1917, where he's no spring chicken at this point. Ives would have been in his mid-40s at this point. But he's kind of watching the world descend into madness and chaos and experiencing that pang that I'm sure everybody was feeling in the climax of the Great War, the First World War. The statistics are coming back about the casualties, the Battle of the Somme. It's all terrible. But Ives is doing what he must have felt was his patriotic duty in supporting his country at a time of war. So here is a song he wrote that captures this sort of everyman, this American boy who grows up as a patriotic boy and then goes to war to fight for his country. Five part in the top something like. March. Second verse. Now, the final verse. once again end in a different key than when we started, having this snap modulation at the end to B flat. Ives was a great patriot, and one of the things that comes up quite a bit in his music is that he had a particular attachment not just to America, that he was such a proud American, but specifically to the land where he grew up. Of course, many of you know he grew up in Danbury, though he did live in Reading, as Elaine pointed out, not far from here, and also not far from here, Putnam State Park. I don't know, was it two to 3 miles away? Drive there in 5-7 minutes, something like that. General Israel Putnam was a kind of a Connecticut institution, Old Put. So anybody ever hear the story about how there was supposed to be one last wolf in Connecticut and it was terrorizing livestock? So what did Old Put do? This is a guy who was born in 1714. That's before George Washington, who was born in 32. He crawled into the den and supposedly, muscled the wolf out of the den, tied it up, and then clubbed it. You can't make this up. I mean, apparently this is a true story. There were enough people who swore to it. And Putnam, he wasn't a soldier. He became one, became a general, but he wasn't a soldier. He was a farmer. And then he fought in the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, and then of course he signed up to defend his country as soon as violence broke out with Great Britain. And when Lexington and Concord happened, I think the story is that Putnam rode 100 miles in a day or two. And he was no spring chicken at that point, but he vaulted onto his horse and rode up, fought at Bunker Hill. From Putnam, we get that quote, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Right? In other words, you have to be very disciplined, conserve your ammunition, shoot at exactly the right time. So Ives, who, as we said, had this incredible connection to New England, and that means Connecticut, but it also means Massachusetts. We'd say Connecticut and Massachusetts come up in the music more than anywhere else. So he wrote this wonderful collection of 3 movements that fall under the title of the work, 3 Places in New England. And this falls under the umbrella of what in art music and concert music is called program music, and specifically these are called tone poems. So a tone poem is a work typically that is meant to either evoke a tableau or a series of images, or perhaps even tell an outright story. And it does so without a singer, without a narrator, without any words of any sort. You are, as a listener, supposed to imagine the story as you're listening to the purely instrumental music. And you would be given a sense of what to imagine because there would be, go figure, program notes. The orchestra is going to give you program notes. So that if you're listening to Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique in 1830, you know that the 5th movement is about this sort of tortured vision of the artist imagining his own funeral procession in hell. That's a great piece if you don't know it. Nice, wholesome family fun. Leonard Bernstein called that piece the first example of psychedelia in orchestral music. Anyway, so 3 Places in New England, a wonderful example of program music and a reflection of Ives's deep and abiding love of New England and its people. You see that in the Concord Sonata, where each movement is dedicated to various people who are kind of institutions: Emerson, Thoreau, the Alcotts, Hawthorne. Right? Those are the movements of the Concord Sonata. But we see it also in his exaltation of the New England landscape. The 3rd movement, for example, in 3 Places in New England, is called the Housatonic at Stockbridge. I think Sean's going to talk to us at the end of the program about it. So each of these 3 movements is worthy of our attention. But we're going to focus on the second one in the remaining time we have, because there could not be a better piece to study in our particular geographical location. The second movement is called Putnam's Camp, Colburn, Reading, Connecticut. And it tells the story of this really brutal winter, 1778-79, during the Revolutionary War. And Putnam, this is sometimes, by the way, called the Connecticut's Valley Forge, because it was so cold and so brutal. And the soldiers were, at this point, they were so battle-worn and so weather-beaten that some of them, their shoes were falling apart, they didn't have what to eat. You can imagine the barber surgeons who had been busy with the amputees, and they're all sort of just like hunkered down, waiting here in Reading, Connecticut during this brutal winter of 1778-79. And old Put, as he was called, General Putnam, is he reclining luxuriously in some palatial tent? No. He's making his rounds, rubbing elbows with the hoi polloi, talking to the soldiers, telling jokes, and apparently, according to legend, sharing his own rations. So he really earned the admiration and the respect of this regiment, which was like 3,000 people strong, who were suffering through this brutal winter after having fought the British and gearing up for the next battle. And where were they? Probably not more than a, I don't know, 20-minute, maybe 30-minute walk from where we are here, only a couple miles away. So let's go ahead and listen to 3 places in New England. And this, of all ensembles we're going to listen to, is the Frankfurt Radio Symphony Orchestra. The reason I chose this recording, not only is it a great recording, but also it shows us how Ives' music is not merely performed in American concert halls or in American recital settings or in American college classrooms and studied in American chamber societies. It's not just that. This is an international phenomenon. So here we have the Frankfurt Radio Symphony Orchestra, one of the best orchestras on the planet, frankly, and Frankfurtly. And they're playing Ives here. So here's the second movement, which Ives wrote some program notes for us to imagine what he's conveying. And he's conveying, it starts with a reverie. That is to say, imagine we're on the village green, and we're ready for the 4th of July. And all of a sudden, boy falls asleep. Boy is a sort of a poetic stand-in for the audience member. And you fall asleep. And then we get this dreamy music in the middle section. So the beginning is march music, and we're ready for the 4th of July. And then the boy falls asleep. And he imagines Lady Liberty herself spurring the soldiers on to fight for freedom. And then bang, fortissimo, the orchestra's back, rip-roaring into action. And it's the 4th of July on the village green, and there's fireworks, and there's food and drink and candy and who knows what else, everything the king could possibly want. And Ives, if you think about him as a composer, he was like a little kid in a candy store. The music was his avocation, but the piano and the manuscript paper, this was his playground. It's really important to think of it that way, because Ives he wasn't concerned about selling tickets to the concert. He wasn't concerned about what the academicians in the Ivory Tower universities were going to say about his music. He was writing for himself. And there is something wonderfully innocent and childlike about that. Of course, there's nothing childlike about the music, because the music's incredibly sophisticated. See if you can catch any of the quotations that Ives brings into this multi-layered orchestra. To the uninitiated, this music may sound incoherently tumultuous, like the stereotypical description of the orchestra warming up. The instruments are being warmed up by their players, and there's no rhyme or reason to the music. Think about it this way. Everything that you just heard has to be notated very precisely. So that chaos, in other words, has to be tamed by Ives. It's really remarkable to think about someone who can hear that kind of layer of rhythmic dissonance and, of course, tonal dissonance and bring it out coherently in the sheet music. It's incredibly difficult. If you wanted to transcribe Mozart, it's easy to do. If you want to transcribe any kind of music that moves in predictable rhythmic values, it's easy to do. But how do you transcribe these kinds of rhythms? These include what we call nested tuplets and syncopated music, where you have nested music inside of syncopations. It's incredibly hard. It takes remarkably good, facile music readers to be able to play this music. And ask anyone who's ever tried. This is not music that you can casually sight read the way you would, for example, music of the classical period, Big C classical. This is music that is extraordinarily sophisticated. And if you're wondering about the layers of dissonance and chaos, remember this was written at a time, that is to say, Ives was writing music at a time when Schoenberg was writing Pierrot Lunaire, and Stravinsky's writing The Rite of Spring, and Alban Berg is writing Wozzeck. This is the 20th century, and composers felt that tonality had its day in the sun. And it lasted from, say, Monteverdi in the early 17th century through the end of the Romantic period. few hundred years. That's a pretty good run. But it's time for something else now. And that was the attitude of composers in the early 20th century, that tonal music had been explored to the maximum degree. There was really nothing left to say in the tonal idiom. And so what was now required of composers was to explore increasingly atonal, sometimes very blatantly atonal styles. Arnold Schoenberg, when he codified the 12-tone system, the dodecaphonic system, which is very, very strictly organized atonality, he said, I have developed a system of writing music that will ensure the supremacy of German art music for the next 100 years. And of course, Schoenberg wasn't even German, he was Austrian, and by the early 1930s, he was on his way to America. As for Ives, America was what he was primarily interested in as a composer. He knew about the other genres, he knew about the other composers, he had studied music history, but he was interested in glorifying America through his music. And we've seen several examples of that here today. There are many others. They would include works like the Concord Sonata, which I mentioned but we didn't listen to, and like the symphonies, especially the Fourth Symphony, which is a very, very difficult piece to wrap your ear around. At one point, the time signature is 4/2/4. That means sadly. Well, this is a testament to Ives's forward-looking mentality as a composer. He really was, in many ways, ahead of his time, and I think it's fair to say that without Charles Ives, the American musical landscape in the 20th century may have very well looked very different. That composers like Copland and Bernstein and Sondheim and the others I mentioned, they were in some way, in some shape, form, or fashion, taking their cue from Charles Ives, who had pioneered a rugged embrace of, let's say, a balance between tonality and atonality. That not everything is atonal, there are elements of atonality. The music is still tonal by and large, but it's not tonal in the way that Mozart or Beethoven's music is tonal. And the most fascinating part about it, perhaps, is that Ives was not technically a professional musician. He happened to be a very successful insurance salesman who loved writing music. And today, we are seeing in the last 50 years especially, and of course even today as we've seen in some of the videos we've watched, Ives's music is still studied, still performed, and when it comes to the American corpus of concert music and art music and what we broadly refer to as classical music, small c classical music, Ives is justifiably considered the father of sort of patriarchal figure, the father of American concert music. And as we've seen tonight, we've got a sense of why that is. So I hope you've enjoyed learning about Charles Ives, and I think there might be some questions, and I want to invite Sean up to talk about Bridgeport Symphony Orchestra, and they have an Ives project coming up. Yes, question?
The organist had high heels on. Was that intentional? Was that help him play?
Well, they may look like high heels, but they're heels. Let me see if I can find it.
Yeah, heels on.
Yeah.
Yes.
It looked advantageous to wear something like
So,
that.
yeah, there you go. There is a pronounced heel to organ shoes, and that's by design. Organists play with a heel-toe technique. So if you were to play a scale, you would alternate heel-toe, heel-toe. So most organists will wear very specific footwear that is designed for playing the organ. And there are some, like Cameron Carpenter is a very flamboyant organist who wears jeweled, sequins, sparkly boots. But no matter what, most organists favor something with a heel on it. And that's to better be able to articulate the heel-toe technique.
So for the Putnam piece,
Yeah.
If let's say there's 12 violins, were they all playing the same score, or did he say I want 3 of them playing this and 4 of them playing this?
He does do that latter
Yeah.
effect that you talked about. But here, no, he'll have them all playing. In a standard orchestra, you divide the violins into violin 1 and violin 2, and then there can be divisi parts. So I'm not sure exactly how Putnam's camp unfolds, but it's all one orchestra. Now in the Fourth Symphony, he has 2 orchestras. There's the main orchestra, and then there's a smaller orchestra that's designated to be something like at least 100 feet away. And he wants them distant from the main ensemble and from the conductor. And they're playing sometimes synchronously and sometimes something completely different. So he does call for that. Supposedly when he was a kid, he was fascinated with the sound of he would stand up, sit on the rooftops in Danbury, and he would listen to, when they would have big, for example, big parades and big festivities on the streets, he would listen to the sounds of different marching bands, especially as they were across town and marching towards each other or away from each other. And he was fascinated by the sounds, converging sounds of music that was in a different key and in a different time signature, a different rhythm, whatever it was. And that's where they say that he got this idea from and why he included it in his music. All came from Daddy, in other words.
We have a question from
Sure.
the Zoom audience. So this writing says, tomorrow at Carnegie, I plan to hear Ives' Variations on America, arranged by Farrington.
I don't know that one. I know William Schubert did a setting of it for orchestra, and that's the one that I'm more familiar with.
Okay, he was just wondering if you had any comments on this arrangement.
I'm sure it's good. The orchestral arrangement I'm familiar with is by a guy named, I think his name is William Schumann, not Schubert, Schumann. And the great thing about using an orchestra versus an organ is that you can tap into what the Germans call Klangfarbe, sound color. That you can utilize the color palette of the orchestra to bring out different voicings. You can do that on an organ too, by the way. If you ever notice there are these knobs on the side of the organ, or sometimes on fancy electric organs, they're buttons. We call those stops, which is where we get the expression pulling out all the stops. When you exert maximum effort, you will pull out all the stops. On an old Baroque organ, when you pulled out all the stops, it opened all the pipes and would create the maximum sound, which would shake the building basically. But ultimately an organ is an organ, and there's a limit to the different number of colors you can get because you only have 4 manuals, let's say, and a pedal board, whereas an orchestra has far more options than that. So the William Schumann arrangement of the Variations on America for orchestra is wonderful. And there are many recordings online, but I don't know the one by the composer that they're doing tomorrow. But it just shows us that composers are still fascinated with Ives' music and arranging it. Yeah.
When I was in high school, we had an all-county band that played an arrangement of it,
Sure.
which was really fun.
Yeah, I mean, Ives loved band music. He really loved brass and winds and percussion, and he used a lot of it, as you saw there, in 3 places in England.
The song about World War I, do
He's
you
there.
have a sense of who would have sung that and where?
Great question. Ives wrote a ton of songs. I mean, hundreds. And it's unclear if he had a particular soloist in mind. Sometimes he did when it came to his piano works. For example, with the Concord Sonata, he was a virtuoso pianist. It's a very difficult work. At one point in the work, he calls for the pianist to produce a stick that is measured to very specific dimensions, and to put that stick on the piano so that you can play a very specific tone cluster. You put it on and you press it down so you can play all of these adjacent keys, as opposed to using your forearm, which is rather inaccurate compared to a stick. But we know that Ives would have played the Concord Sonata himself. Eventually, the great champion of that work became his son-in-law, married his younger daughter, a guy named Patrick, and that recording is from the late 40s and is still a fairly famous recording. But as far as the songs go, I don't know that he really thought that they would be performed by anyone at all. So he wrote them for various voices, soprano, baritone, tenor, whatever it was.
Was he appreciated locally?
People, I actually, in preparing some notes for today, I did some research on that. And people in town in Reading knew him as a kind of eccentric guy who always seemed to be humming or tapping his fingers on the train. And he'd be waiting at the train station, and he'd get on the train, and presumably there were many others who would see him on the train. And he would be humming and sketching music on his train ride. Imagine a world where there's no congested I-95 going down to Manhattan. We're talking the first decade of the 20th century. And that's when Ives was taking the train down to Wall Street. And so he was known as an eccentric artist type.
But there's no record of local concerts that he had? Or
Not really, no. He wrote in his living room.
Oh.
And he shuffled the music into a cabinet somewhere. And he never really imagined that it would get performed. Later on, he became more interested in having his music performed, and he self-financed the publication of his own works and self-financed the printing of those works and copying so that he could send hundreds of copies of works and out to parties that might be interested. Concord Sonata is the most famous example because apparently he sent hundreds of copies all over, including over to France, where Nadia Boulanger got her hands on a copy and was blown away. And she was considered one of the great pianists of the early 20th century. So, yes.
So, I just wanted to reference three pieces because I think they're a lot of fun. I had the privilege of singing with Greg Smith when I was in college. He was a big Ives fan and interpreter. One of them is Circus Band,
Yes.
which is just as joyous and eclectic as you can imagine. And it features that sensation of two bands meeting, clustering, and then going their separate ways. Another piece is Psalm 67, which was written and sung in two keys at the same time, and it actually works. I think it was G minor and C major. And the third was Psalm 90, which I don't know how big the chorus was, but at one point we broke into 23 separate pieces as on the word wrath.
Oh.
And it sort of blew up into
big
this
cluster.
enormous thing and then contracted. So if anybody has an opportunity to track down those three pieces, they're really special.
That's right. He did set a number of psalms as music, and that's great that you had a director who programmed it, because it's very ambitious programming for a college choir, for a young choir, even for a community choir. It's very ambitious to ask people who aren't professional singers to sing music which is so challenging in hearing the pitches. If you're hearing a C major chord and you have to find a note that's, let's say, an E flat. E flat is not in C major. You're going to hear an E natural, so you have to find that pitch and sing it in tune. It's very hard to do that. Sometimes you might sing microtones. And some people say, well, can the human voice sing microtonal music? And the answer is yes, people sing microtones all the time, not on purpose though. Yes.
Because of the general dynamism, has he ever been picked up in the cartoons?
I don't think so, no. That's a good question, right? Cartoons, if you think about Rossini and Wagner and Verdi and the Looney Tunes, which introduced so many young people to concert music and opera, but no, not to my knowledge.
Other question from Zoom, and then I think maybe we could take one more question from the audience and move on. Can you compare John Philip Sousa to Ives?
Yeah, sure. Sousa might be considered the father of the American March. He was a wind band composer primarily who wrote some of the most celebrated marches, which are still big today. Washington Post, Stars and Stripes Forever, probably the most famous piccolo solo ever in Stars and Stripes Forever. But Sousa was writing tonal music and writing specifically the kind of music that George Ives would have, they didn't exactly overlap. Sousa would have been a bit younger. But Sousa's music was tonal, and it was meant for marching bands, and it was meant for big public celebrations and parades and things of that nature. And Ives' music is far more dissonant, far more experimental. It uses polytonality and quarter tones and collage technique. And if there was any overlap at all, it would be that Ives might have quoted Sousa tunes in his music. But they were just writing for very different purposes, is I guess how I would summarize it. Sousa is a great giant of early American music, but really because it's so limited in scope to his marches, it's not like Ives, who wrote lieder, art songs, and he wrote symphonies, and he wrote big orchestral tone poems, and he wrote towering sonatas like the Concord Sonata, and he wrote big choral pieces. His symphonies have chorus. Symphony number 4 has chorus in it, and all these other pioneering, experimental techniques make him quite separate from Sousa. Although they certainly are not. They're not related like siblings. You might say that musically they're cousins.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, folks. Thanks to the Mark Twain Library. Thanks to the